that's happening. And we have in the room here a whole lot of people who are training to be storytellers. You know, that's a lot of what preachers do. That's a lot of what public moral leaders do. They tell us stories. And so I hope that kind of as this conversation goes on, we can both dig into this sort of wide range of policies and talk about what do we know about what makes a difference, because that's a striking thing to say. We know more today than we did in '68, and yet in some ways we're less equipped to implement them. And a lot of that has to do with this whole issue of public will and the stories that we have been told and the stories that we tell about what's possible. So I wanted to bring Elizabeth into the conversation because she's done so much as a historian on the stories that get told. So talk to us about what stories were told to push back against Kerner initially, and kind of how you see that at work in the world right now.
Well, first, Jonathan, thank you so much for convening us and inviting me to participate. I'm really honored to be here. Thank all of you also for coming and joining this critical conversation. And Alan, thank you for bringing me into the very important work that you're doing around the Kerner Commission, and for your inspiring and powerful remarks this afternoon. You know, the ultimate response to, I argue in my research, the ultimate response to the Kerner Commission and the moment of, the high moment of progressive social change and civil rights revolution in this country was mass criminalization, was the expansion of policing in targeted low-income, poor communities of color, the expansion of surveillance, especially in those communities, but surveillance in general in American society, and of course the vast and marked expansion of our prison system, ultimately, you know, making the United States the world's leading incarcerator, but framing the long-term response to the civil rights movement, to progressive social change, to demographic change in American society, in a moment when policymakers at the very highest level of government and liberal policymakers like Lyndon Johnson were presented by the Kerner Commission with alternatives and with an entirely different set of investments that they could have made, right? Instead of investing in police, instead of investing in a job creation program for police officers with the war on crime, instead of investing in a job creation program for low-income people of color, right, the federal government invests in a job creation program for police officers with the programs of the war on crime. So there was an alternative path. It's not like we didn't have the resources to do it. And you know, a decision was made to go in this path, on the punitive path, on the criminalizing path, of course with vast consequences for generations of low-income people and people of color in particular. And we see now, you know, that path, I mean, this has been building for decades, really since the Reagan administration, but you know, we're really, it seems like this administration is amping up that path to systematically detain migrants. I think one of the most striking examples, or one of the most striking examples of the way that the Kerner Commission's work was kind of warped, to me, appears in the way that during the Nixon administration, beginning in 1970, policymakers began to project and predict that the prison population, that the prisons of the United States would expand. And their basis for these projections and predictions were in part informed by population projections that the Kerner Commission made that later proved to be false. The Kerner Commission projected that the fastest growing population in the United States was black youth, between the ages of 15 and 24, which happened to be the kind of like same population, especially in the mid-1960s, that policymakers were very worried about, that policymakers saw as responsible for crime in the nation, and used this prediction to essentially anticipate the growth of the US prison system, the subsequent investment at the federal level and at all levels of government in the prison system. So the federal government starts giving, beginning in 1970, when these projections and predictions are being made, essentially 75% off coupons to states to build new prisons. And of course, this is in the decade leading up to Ronald Reagan. So much of the, I mean, that kind of ties it right there. Instead of saying, okay, you know, let's create jobs, instead, federal policymakers chose to create prisons. And by the end of the decade, and this is, you know, an incredibly cynical approach to policy, when those same projections about black youth populations proved to be false, policymakers started using unemployment figures to predict and project prison populations, which really from any kind of a moral, ethical sense makes no sense. You know, when I was seeing the archives around this, and if you're interested, this is all detailed in my first book, From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime, including some images of these projections in the documents from the Nixon administration that I discovered. I couldn't wrap my head around how you could project for prison populations in the first place. How can you project that people are going to commit crimes? How can you project that prisons are going to grow? Shouldn't the assumption be based on something else? But it makes no sense that the response to unemployment, if you know that unemployment is a predictor of crime, would be building prisons rather than just giving people jobs. But this is the kind of mislogic policy that has guided, right, all of the paths that Alan was talking about. And I think, you know, it's not like it's not as if we don't have alternatives. I think that the attention that you pay to taxes, you know, a lot of people say, well, we don't have money to do this. Yes, we do. If we tax differently, we would have all kinds of new, if we tax corporations fairly, we would have a very robust social welfare state that would change basic conditions that the poorest people in the United States are facing. Everybody in this country, everybody around the world should have the right to clean water. That's not something that everybody in the United States enjoys. Working plumbing, access to robust educational opportunities. And the systematic denial of these educational opportunities, the systematic denial of being able to tell truthful stories about how we got here so we can figure out how we might create a better future, is again part of this long-term project to maintain elite power, to maintain racial hierarchies in the United States, and prevent us from coming closer to a more equally distributed, robust multiracial democracy that the Kerner Commission envisioned, and that Dr. King and Dr. Barber and others live out in the work that they do in the society that they help us get closer to building every day.
Can I ask you, Elizabeth, so you're telling a story about how policy decisions shaped the lives of communities that were over-policed and people that went to, you know, prison. I mean, I live in a neighborhood where for a whole generation, every family had somebody that went to prison. Right. This reshaped whole communities. Yep. We talk a lot at the center about, you know, shifting the moral narrative in order to build this new will. What moral narrative was necessary to convince people that those were the policies that were needed?
Yeah, so, you know, and this is, again, I think something that the Kerner Commission had attempted to intervene on. You know, the idea, and this is a long-held narrative in the American public and political imagination that really begins to emerge immediately after emancipation. The linking of blackness with criminality, the long-standing idea that black people, that people of color are inherently violent, and are inherently a threat to American democracy. I think one of the big questions of U.S. history, especially from the perspective of white political elites, are what are we going to do with free black people? I mean, there's a constant fear, and many, you know, of the laws enacted from slavery on has been trying to prevent any kind of political mobilization, organizing, dismantling of the racial hierarchies that have structured this nation historically. So that question of what to do with free black people as it gets kind of navigated in the post-emancipation period and beyond is to link blackness with criminality. So instead of, you know, a big part of my work, especially in my second book, and of course the Kerner Commission was formed in response to what I call the rebellions of the 1960s, which really, I think should be seen as a form of political violence that emerged in response of the unfinished, unfulfilled promises of the civil rights movement that didn't, much like the Reconstruction period, due to the limitations of federal policy, gave people political enfranchisement without economic enfranchisement. So the lack of economic change, things I've been talking about, the lack of educational opportunities, jobs, decent housing for people, policies that meet people's basic needs and also, include full political and economic inclusion in U.S. society. That's what that violence was about. When people for decades, try nonviolent direct action protests, try lawsuits, try petitions, and it doesn't work, and you're getting abused by police, and you have no recourse, you've tried the other route, the response is violence. And instead of taking a step back and saying, okay, let's really look at this, as the Kerner Commission did, let's try to understand what are the root causes of this violence. The Kerner Commission, of course, famously identified it as white racism and socioeconomic inequality rather than black pathology. When you dig in and you understand that that's the root cause, that these are rebellions, that they're not riots, that they're not criminal acts, then that allows us to think about a whole range of solutions outside of more policing and law enforcement, which of course is the catalyst for many of these incidents in the first place. So the narrative, though, and this is why I think the terminology is so important around the word riot, because when we use the word riot, then these acts are criminal, they need to be punished. The people that enact them are inherently criminal, and the solution is policing, right? And I think that's been the kind of story of, when this was in question in the 1960s, by the 1970s, especially with, Nixon on, and liberal presidents since Nixon, have kind of adopted this idea that certain groups, minoritized groups in U.S. society are inherently criminal, and the best way to manage the problems of poverty and inequality is to lock people up, remove them from their communities, and warehouse them in prisons that are usually located very, very far away from their home communities for extremely, extremely long sentences. So the thing that sustains that, and of course we see it in the rhetoric around migrants and immigration, is that, certain groups of people deserve this because they are criminals. And that's an old trope that we see through as history. When you criminalize people, then you can legally and through political and policy frameworks enact undue harm upon them.
Yeah, thank you.
As opposed to your work, Elizabeth, one of the most destructive academics was John DiIlio, a professor, who coined the notion that, yes, for the future, we're going to see more and more predators.
Yep.
And predators meant young black men. And that word, that phrase and associated phrases, that word predators, got picked up by the media, which loved it. And that was really responsible for much of what Elizabeth is talking about.
Can I just add one thing on that before we move on? I think like where you see that in action, and thank you so much for making that point, Alan, is that, like in the early 90s when these things are being, when the idea of the super predators coming out and all of these horrible policies that really lead to, the drastic explosion in the US prison population, we get the system where mass incarceration is essentially about locking up, systematically locking up black and brown children and teenagers, super predators, for most of their adult lives in faraway prisons. That's what mass incarceration, it's taking black children and teenagers under these kind of like ideas of super predator ideas and just putting them in prison for most of their lives. That's what it is.
And the super predator professor later apologized.
Yep, because it was wrong, just like the same statistics that were used to justify the kind of beginnings of mass incarceration in the 1970s, the preparation for it and the expansion and investment into prisons.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. One of the things about the super predator is that that is a character that's created to tell a moral story, right? Because no one ever wants to do something for nefarious reasons, right? People want to do what they do for the best of reasons. So you need this character of the super predator in order to, you know, rally the troops to protect these people, whoever these people are. In this case, you know, innocent white children who might be subject to, you know, this predator's advances. So, yeah, these moral narratives are always at play. And Miroslav, you know very well that they're connected to our scripture texts, our faith stories. Yeah, how do you want to enter this conversation as somebody who thinks about these things from that side?
First,
let's get you on. I might take a flip of that switch.
Flip of that switch.
You can use mine.
There we go. There we go.
Trade me, and then you can.
Here we do go.
There we go.
Okay. I'll hold it. First, I want to just thank Jonathan, you, for inviting me to be part of this conversation. As you will very soon know, I'm no expert on this issue, as my fellow panelists here are. I speak as an amateur. I speak as a person who is really interested in the question, who's moved by the question, who wants to bring some of the theological resources to bear on the question, and even there, this is not my specialization. Just a very important concern. And as I was listening to introductory comments, also comments by Elizabeth, somehow I had a sense, especially also reading the book, we know so much about the causes of poverty, and evidence-based action should be a relatively clear thing for us to do. And yet, after I finished reading, especially the introduction to the book, where it is, we know we should, we need to, and it's rhetoric is there that's kind of carrying me with, and I realize, well, but we are not. And so the immediate question for me was, and this has been a question that plagued me over the many decades, is why not? Why not, and why has, if I read things rightly, culturally, and certainly that is true within Christian communities, why has the situation in fact deteriorated? And you can see it also just by looking at, say, evangelical community and how the assessment of inequality. Some of you will know the name of John Stott. He died a few years back. He is the Mr. Evangelical in the 80s, I think mid-80s. He wrote a book on kind of moral issues facing Christians, and one of those issues was the issue of inequality. And then he proposed there, as a kind of a reasonable proposal, that the discrepancy between the lowest paid and highest paid employee in an organization should be 1 to 7. Now, if you look at it from current perspective, this is clear Marxism. There can be a communism, right? This is unimaginable that one would even think in those terms. And it's also the same in any communities that you look. And the question is why? Why is it the case? Why can Pope Benedict XVI call the poor the first, God's first love, and yet that all leaves everybody kind of indifferent, as if it meant virtually nothing? We don't believe the Pope, we don't believe in God, at least we don't believe in that God whose first love are the poor. And so for me, the really fundamental question where I sit, this is not the only question, certainly, but fundamental question where I sit is why? what are some of the reasons for this abandonment of the poor? And one of the books that I found very, very helpful, I don't know if you're familiar with it, maybe some of you are, it's called Aporophobia. And subtitle is Why We Reject the Poor Instead of Helping Them. It's a Spanish moral philosopher. And she starts, the aporophobia means the fear of the poor. Xenophobia, homophobia, aporophobia, and she coined that term. The reason she coined that term is because she thought we need to have a term for something that is actually real but is not recognized, that we actually fear not simply of foreigners, not simply people who have different practices than we do, sexual and otherwise, but we fear also people who are poor. And so she traces this fear for the poor in the contrast during the Brexit in Europe. There was obviously rhetoric against the immigrants, as we experience the rhetoric right now was high. But immigrants who were doctors and professionals were exempt from that rhetoric. Immigrants in Spain who came from England and were retirees with good chunk of change to spend, they were exempt from that rhetoric. And then she realized that there is this category of the poor, and she asked the question, why is it that we have this phobia of the poor? I'm not necessarily wedded completely to her answer, but I think that's the right question to ask. And what she suggests is that we live in kind of economies of mutual benefit. And the poor are perceived as the ones who cannot benefit anyone. And because they cannot benefit other people, or at least middle class, things that poor can be of no benefit to them. And therefore, one can turn away from them and practically go one's own way. So in a sense, the poor are not keeping their part of the social bargain. Is the basic idea that informs this. She goes into biological reasons for that and so forth, and you can read the book if you're interested. Now, I think when we live, as I think is true today, not just in societies of kind of mutual benefit, as a kind of social imaginary, not as reality. If we imagine ourselves to live in societies like that, we don't do just that. We also live in performance societies. So that we constantly need to up our performance in order to be competitive. And if we fail to do that, we fall behind. And then suddenly the poor are not only not doing their share, but poor emerge as those who do not, who kind of drag us back and don't allow us to be in the position in which we hope to find ourselves and in a position toward which we aspire. And that struck me then, reminded me of a text that I read. Some of you will know that I'm here, students will know that I'm a fan of Martin Luther, of two Martin Luthers. One is the king, and the other one is not quite the king, the reformer.
But a namesake, according to the family.
A namesake, yes. That's right. And he's written a commentary on Magnificat, which is to say the song of Mary when she was pregnant and she visited Elizabeth. And in that song, she praises God for turning the tables in many ways, of power, of wealth. And Luther is writing then a commentary on that. By the way, just a footnote, I'm totally amazed always when I think of that song being placed in the mouth of Mary. From Nazareth, I think 400 mud built houses in that place. At the very edge of an empire. And what is she dreaming about? God taking down the great, the mighty from their thrones and establishing the messianic kingdom. It's amazing what a scope of imagination is evidenced just in that song of that 17, 15, whatever, how old young girl that she was. Now, Luther writes commentary, and he begins by discussing about nature of God, the mighty one, who undoes the differences between those who have and those who have not, have power, have resources, and those who have not. And then he writes, well, God is the highest. And this is typical of Luther's writing. And by the way, he is writing this text to his immediate political superior. So this is a political tract that he is actually writing, placing it in his hands. And so he writes, God is the Almighty, which is, or the highest, which means, what does God do when God is the highest? God does not look up, because there's nothing and nobody up. God does not look to one side or the other, because there's no one who is equal to him. The only place where God can look is God can look down. And then Luther said, the further down you are, the better God sees you. which is marvelous statement about concern for those who are kind of nobodies of this world. And then he makes a comment, but what do we tend to do? Well, we always tend to look up, which is to say, wherever there is power, wherever there is wealth, wherever there is knowledge, that's where I aspire to be. With that is what we identify. And we flee from contact with that which is weak, with that which is broken, with that which is hungry, and so forth, that which has a claim on us, which will not take us up, but which somehow we perceive as it will take us down. And it would seem to me that we need to, at least in the Christian tradition, we need to rediscover this commitment for that which is low down, so that we can lift the people up from where they find ourselves. Otherwise, where is the will? That's what I always ask. And that's the great question that always, in many domains of our lives, troubles us. We know stuff, but will is weak, and sometimes even when we try, it's broken. And I think this nurturing of the moral imagination, of what it is that is the highest actually, and what the highest is that does. What does the highest do? As well as nurturing ourselves, a sense that we are truly and fully ourselves when we align ourselves with purposes of God, when we are not afraid of the poor, but go and encounter the poor and be with them and lift them up. All of us have stories I shouldn't say that. I have a story, and some of my friends told me similar stories, where you think you are immune to this. I'll tell you just very briefly about my own story of being afraid of the poor. I was traveling from Kosovo with my wife, traveling from Kosovo in former Yugoslavia, from Kosovo through Skopje to Belgrade. And we were going on the bus, and bus was an absolute disaster. I didn't have a proper seat. I was so frustrated. I came to Skopje, and there I sit and I'm eating. We are sitting and we're eating 2 pizzas we've ordered. And there's this little boy, Roma boy, who comes and he wants to ask for something to eat. And I don't know where I am, what happened to me, that bus ride must have gotten to me, and I just brush him off. And I feel terrible for doing that. I see my wife looking at me, and she thinks this is really bad, really bad. Then we go up and have a bus ride from Skopje to Belgrade, And I'm now frustrated about everything on that bus ride. And we arrive, and I had the worst of all of our arguments with my wife because I was so bad-tempered. I think that little boy was at the center of my bad temper and my inability to kind of overcome. What would have happened to that journey had I said, oh, let's pull another seat, I order you a pizza, come sit with us. We are here in a bus station. The whole thing would have been transformed. I would have been transformed, and the whole situation would have been transformed. And I sometimes think that this aporophobia, which was at work in significant degree in my own experience, is what's holding us back. And so I think it's a deeply spiritual, it's structural issue, no doubt about that. It's cultural, broadly cultural issue, but it's deeply spiritual issue. And on all three of these levels that I've just named, structural, spiritual, cultural, and spiritual, we have to work to elevate the poor and change ourselves.
Well, thank you. You've named I'll come to you in just a second. You've named a Christian tradition that that challenges these distorted moral narratives like Elizabeth was describing. I think we're all aware this week that, like, if a very simple articulation of that Christian vision in a sermon is presented to some politicians, there's a sort of violent response. I mean, there's a rejection of that narrative that happens. But that is there in the Christian tradition and in other traditions as a resource for creating this new will. And part of what we want to talk about is sort of what role folks here and our communities can play in building that will. So, Alan, you jump in, and then I want to bring folks here in the room in while we still have time.
Sure, just quickly. Fear of the poor. But during the pandemic, we reduced poverty by half through legislation, child tax credit legislation. So we can do it. And I don't know if the legislators were afraid of the poor, but they did it. And then 2 years later, the legislation lapsed and they didn't reauthorize it. So poverty went down by half, and then it increased by the same amount. What does that say about fear of the poor?
What's maybe interesting that it was not specifically motivated by elevating of the poor, but it took pandemic in order to motivate the action, so that this was almost like a consequence of motivation to do something different.
And did it not take John Kennedy to be assassinated for Lyndon Johnson to pass the Great Society legislation? So are we an amoral country that just is pragmatic for a while and then we forget about things?
As I go to our broader community here, and feel free to raise your hand if you have a comment or thought. Elizabeth, we were talking before, like, as a historian, what do you say about the potential for change, maybe even when things look at their worst?
Yeah, so, on this moment, I think one of the things that people are talking about a lot, and it's kind of like the vibe, the mood in 2016, a lot of people were amped up for resistance, and now it seems like there's kind of more of a resignation. But history reminds us, right, this is not, and some people are like, just think everything is doomsday. I can't go there, in part because history tells us that it's not. There's like, change is always possible. When people think that something is totalizing and it's forever and it's, messed up the nation, that's not the case. Nobody in 1860 would have expected or predicted that within 5 years slavery would be abolished. And that's one of the most, profound transformations in U.S. society, even if we haven't really completely lived up to the promise of emancipation. But I think one of the things that's keeping me going right now is that, we keep fighting and we keep imagining and we keep educating ourselves and pushing for change, because history shows us that it can be there and it will be there, and we can lay the groundworks now to think about what would it take to get that child tax credit enacted, and to give and to redistribute resources in this country. I think part of the tactic is to make people feel helpless, to make people feel like they can't do anything, to make people feel that it's inevitable. And one of the big things about that history shows us is that nothing is inevitable, and that the capacity for change is in each of us, and it is mass mobilization, working in community, in alliance, in coalition, in partnership, and in love that creates new societies, and that creates change, and that dismantles structures of oppression. So that's one of the ideas that's keeping me going, one of the big lessons from history.
Oh, thank you for that. Yeah, give her a hand. Amen. I see some of our students here. We were talking in class just this week about how we were reading Danielle Allen's great work on the Declaration of Independence, and she talks in there about how in democratic conversations we need experts, but everyone is equal in their capacity to name how what's going on impacts them, right? So we need everyone's voices with experts weighing in. So we have some experts here, but we need everyone's voices. We need folks to weigh in. How does this land where you are? So who'd like to join the conversation? Esther?
Thank you so much for speaking and sharing your research and hard work and insights. My name is Esther. I'm a first-year student at the Div School. I came here directly from a fellowship in Congress. And I am wondering a lot about the last comment made about how we have such a tendency to look up, whether it's fear of what might happen if we look down or whether we might be dragged down. And I can't help thinking about how there's such a strong desire to also look for solutions by looking up and thinking about scale and impact and big picture, because that's what's going to create the most change for the most number of people. And I'm wondering, is there a way to navigate, any insights or stories, is there a way to navigate the tension between looking up in a positive, constructive way with the mentality maybe of like people who are below or like down, or will there always be a crisis of proximity? There's so many people who are working on, I was on like a SNAP portfolio, right? Like there were so many people who I was working with who have never been on food programs, right? Or who have not had these experiences, but still want to advocate. I think my poetry professor, Chris Wyman here, was also talking last week in class about how there's such an assault on individual consciousness that's happening. And I also think I saw a lot of that when I was working in government. Like when you look up, there's an assault on individual consciousness, things being subsumed for the greater good, for the bigger picture. And so this tension between look down, maybe work on your locality, your own spheres, versus work for impact and for big picture.
Just quickly, I think in some sense looking down is identifying with what is down, and then the question becomes, what are the modes and ways in which we can best impact, best create change. And my sense is that we need to work at all three of these levels that I mentioned: systemic, cultural, and also very, very personal. And part of the reason for giving the story of myself is the importance, is to emphasize the importance of personal. So up and down here are slightly differently were slightly differently meant.
I think part of it is amplifying the voices of and doing everything that we can to support the amplification of the most marginalized groups among us. And I think we've seen again and again the way that when that amplification happens, we can get change, whether it's from like Michael Harrington's work and all the new studies about poor people. I mean, I think part of it is, you know, putting people in the driver's seat to tell their own testimony, to share their own testimony and tell their own stories, that helps build wide support for the war on poverty. Or, you know, like thinking about in the years leading up to abolition, the way that the narratives and testimony of enslaved people really helped move the needle and build awareness of what was actually going on in the slave system. You know, behind the veil of the Southern planters' propaganda. So I think part of it is that, and again, the threat of these stories, these histories being told has been under attack, you know, especially since 2020, right, which is the height of mass mobilization in this country, when the vast majority of Americans were asking new questions about police brutality and systemic racism and all of these things. The response to that was to call it woke, was to shut it down, was culture war, which I think also reflects the power of this kind of like growing awareness and the potential power of continuing to amplify these stories and these experiences, these voices that are intentionally kept from us. The barriers in our society prevent us from understanding common ground, from empathizing with one another, from empathizing with people who we may not come into contact with, in part due to stratification and inequality in our society, and that works to preserve the status quo. So, you know, one step is, again, trying to amplify those voices, trying to amplify the experiences of people who may be very far from those decision-making rooms, from Congress to, you know, the local city hall.
Our daughter is 28, she lives in London, and she's always telling me, oh, Dad, you're a 1960s guy, you're trying to save the world, but London is so cool, and so, and I have my art friends, and I'm going to enjoy life. And I say, Miranda, you can't do that. And so we have that, you're asking one of the most basic questions of our age, and certainly, I don't know, your kids are 3 and 5, maybe you'll be having some dialogues like that in 10 years. I don't, so I don't have a good response other than to say that you got to engage this struggle, and you cannot lose track of progress if it takes 10 years, if it takes 100 years, if it takes 1,000 years. We must move forward, and we must move on, and we can't give up. And we need to be practical as well as spiritual. And maybe Yale should have a new degree that, which integrates theology and running for Congress. And one of the
I like that too. We're getting a PhD.
One of the leaders of the anti-gun group that evolved from the massacre in Florida is a young man, I forget his name, but he's the youngest member of Congress now, and he's as moral as you can get, but you must know his name. He's like 28, about the age of my daughter, and now he's been elevated. He's I think deputy leader of one of the caucuses. Anyway, he's rising quickly, and he's being listened to, and he's combining morality with politics.
Alan, you'll be glad to know that in addition to studying public theology here at the Divinity School, we also partner, the center partners with the Yale Campaign School, so that people who want to run for office can get all the toolkit they need, right down at the law school, actually. Virginia wants to join the conversation.
Thank you so much. Professor Hinton, when you were talking about the federal government offering the communities to build prisons. I was reminded of Lyndon Johnson offering communities to build low-income housing through the New Towns in Town initiative, and the only community that took it was his own city of Washington, D.C. So I guess my question is, what can we do in our local communities to make them accept low-income housing instead of prisons?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. I mean, I think part of it is demanding low-income housing. I mean, I think about what's going on in Connecticut, many towns outside of New Haven, when there's like real resistance. Again, going back to this aporaphobia, real resistance to have multifamily housing in communities like Woodbridge. So I think part of it is being open to the idea and mobilizing people around the idea of having more mixed income communities where everybody can live together and thrive. Organizing around that, again, when you amplify voices of people who are unhoused or who are housing insecure, that helps build empathy among people, and they say, oh, actually, okay, maybe this won't be so bad if we have multifamily housing in our community. Maybe that would be a good thing, and there's a lot of ways that our communities can benefit from having more socioeconomic diversity. So, you know, I think part of it is building awareness around the issue and then mobilizing people to act around it. We often forget, one of the things I really try to instill in my classes all the time is that, you know, it's not like the Civil Rights Act or the War on Poverty or any, you know, just dropped from thin air. It's the result of decades of organizing. And I think that's the other, you know, thing. We're kind of in this age where, you know, it's like instant gratification, like 30-second, you know, tweet or TikTok video or whatever it is. And, you know, that's why the history of the movement is so important, because it takes decades. You might not get the kind of victories that you want immediately, but, you know, you have to think of it, okay, I'm building, I have to be patient, I have to go slow, I have to really build strong coalitions in order to realize the goal. I mean, I think, and this is straying away a little bit from your question, but, you know, I think those of us who are working to build a better society, those of us who are in the movement, recognize we might not see the fruits of our labor in our own lifetime. And my children, my 3-year-old and my 5-year-old might not see the fruit of the labor. I hope my great-grandchildren, my great-great-grandchildren can. And so I think it's always also having a long view and accepting the fact that, you know, the kinds of major social transformations that are necessary, you know, whether it's expanding housing for people or whether it's establishing the Department of Democracy. I would also like there to be a Department of Community Empowerment. That's going to take time, that's going to take dedication and commitment and doing the very hard work of organizing. And not just on social media, you know.
Thank you. We got one more voice here in the back row that wants to jump in.
Hi, I'm Judah. I'm actually a student at Union Theological Seminary. And mostly a comment. I just want to thank you for bringing in mass incarceration to this conversation. I think it's so important. It's such a critical intersection of everything that we're talking about. And I can't help but think, as a person of faith, you know, in scriptures, you know, we hear Jesus say, I was in prison and you visited me, right? And if you come from a context where your job is to bring something, theology, to a place, you forget that there's actually something already there, and that's the people. And in the Christian tradition, that's Jesus, right? And so I think there's something about recognizing that there's voices that we're missing from even this conversation. So I appreciate you including my voice, but recognizing that my voice is actually only a piece of the millions of folks who are missing from our society. And I really believe that some of the answers to these questions in public theology and public policy, we've actually removed them from the conversation. So I just think about, you know, how do we continue, and I have ideas in my own life, but how do we as people who are in the free world having these conversations bring the voices of those who've been removed from the ability to share their ideas to these solutions, and how do we make sure the commissions and other folks hear from those voices as well? So maybe not a question you can answer, but certainly something I think that's an important part of the conversation.
Thank you.
When I was a political appointee at HUD during the Carter administration, we went to Bed-Stuy, the Bedford-Stuyvesant Community Development Corporation. There was a whole tradition led by Bed-Stuy and then Ford Foundation to build houses by nonprofits. We have CDC models that are available. We don't have the funding for them. We further developed through James Rouse and the Enterprise Foundation and through the local initiative support corporations, nonprofit entities that built housing for the poor. That model also worked. We have many models today of housing integration, for example, in Washington, D.C., outside of Washington. In other words, there are the models for housing the poor, but we don't have the will to scale up those models because housing so often involves issues of race.
I really appreciate that question, so thank you. You know, I would just say it's our responsibility to, back to the amplifying voices, not to sound like a broken record, but to make sure that we're being inclusive in our discussions and centering people who have firsthand experience in those discussions. You know, one of the big slogans in the Justice Impacted People's movement is that there's power in proximity, and I really believe that. And I think in order to get out of this, this massive inequality that we are facing in this country, it's going to take a range of different expertise, and it's going to take a recognition that we all have something unique and important to bring to the table. And as we are building to dismantle many of the hierarchies that alienate us and that infuriate us, we have to be very conscious not to be recreating those hierarchies in the work that we do. So I think it's incredibly important that we move in that kind of fellowship, community, and inclusivity. And especially, you know, as a scholar of mass criminalization, you know, and everything I do, from the panels that I organize to the people that I'm in partnership with and learn from, I always try to center and amplify the voices of justice-impacted people themselves. So I think that's, you know, in our work, it's something that we all need to be very cognizant of.
Well, we've come to the end of our time, but I know everybody here will want to join me in thanking each of you. So thank you very much. Again, if you want to continue in, you know, this conversation, which can go much deeper in terms of the details of all these policies and the way to the new will, the book, the resource that this conversation has been based on is called Creating Justice. For those of you who are in the room, we welcome you to get something to drink here afterwards and spend a little time of fellowship. Before we formally close, I just want to make two quick announcements about upcoming events that the center has. One is this coming Monday. Bishop Barber will be the university's MLK speaker for this year in Battelle Chapel. And I think whether you want to be in the chapel or watch it online, you need to register. So for those of you watching online, you can register from wherever. I believe it's open to the general public. But you have to register to get the link for that. That's next Monday evening. And then in about a month, on February 27th, is a Thursday afternoon, here at Yale Divinity School, the center is going to have our first Pellis McShirley Egwavin lecture. And you all will be honored to know that in the room tonight, Roz Pellis, for whom this lecture is named, with some of her colleagues who have been great movement lawyers in the movement. Anyway, we want to have a lecture that really brings our center in conversation with the law school regularly. So we're doing this, and one of Elizabeth's colleagues and A graduate of the Yale Law School will be there, and we'll be talking about how policy around property tax has, and the racist policy around property tax has led many people to lose their homes. So that's based on the book Plundered that is coming out or just out, and we'll be talking about it. So all that coming up. Please stay in touch with us at the center. Thank you for those of you who joined us online, and for those in person, good to be with you.
Thank you. Great, yeah, that was fun.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for organizing.
That was, I really enjoyed it.
Yeah.